If you've ever felt like you were standing in a doorway with nothing on either side of you, no road back, no road forward, then you already know what Eliza Monroe felt in that moment. This is her story, and I promise you, it is worth staying for. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Stories like this one come out regularly, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. And while you're at it, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Eliza. She had left Cincinnati 4 weeks ago with $43, a correspondence that had lasted 8 months, and a belief, desperate and carefully tended, that Gerald Pratt was a man of his word. His letters had been good, not flowery, not overwritten, just solid and plain, the kind of letters a practical man writes when he means what he says. He had a cattle operation near a town called Mill Haven, Wyoming. He needed a capable woman. He wasn't looking for romance, he'd said so plainly in the second letter, but he offered a home, stability, and a chance at something real. He knew about Maggie. He said it didn't matter. Eliza had read that letter so many times the fold lines had started to split. She wasn't naive. She had understood what a mail-order arrangement meant. It was a contract more than a courtship, a practical solution to a practical problem. She had no illusions about walking into a fairy story. She was 27 years old, she had a daughter with no father in the picture, and her options in Cincinnati had narrowed down to almost nothing after her landlord raised the rent 2 months in a row. She wasn't running towards something wonderful. She was running away from something impossible. But she had believed Pratt would keep his word. That was the mistake. She found the station master, a thin man named Hooper, who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years, and explained her situation in as few words as she could manage, because Maggie had woken up and was starting to fuss, and Eliza didn't have the energy to be both composed and detailed at the same time. Hooper listened. He scratched the back of his neck. "There's a bench under the east overhang," he said. "Out of the wind, mostly. Last train till morning is already gone. Is there a boarding house? A hotel, even? Miss." His voice wasn't unkind, just tired. "I'd try Mrs. Culver's on Main, but you'd need money for that." Eliza had $4.60 left. She didn't say so. "Thank you," she said instead, and carried Maggie back out into the dark. The east overhang was exactly what Hooper had promised, a wooden lean-to roof over a long bench, positioned so that the worst of the wind came in sideways instead of straight at you. Small mercy. Eliza sat down, pulled Maggie onto her lap, and wrapped her thin shawl around them both. The shawl was wool, but it wasn't thick. She'd sold her good coat in Kansas City when the train transfer had cost more than she'd budgeted for. Maggie pressed her face against Eliza's collarbone and said, "Hungry." "I know, sweetheart. Is there food?" Eliza had half a biscuit in her coat pocket from a stop 2 stations back. She'd been saving it. She broke it in half now and gave Maggie the larger piece. "Eat slow," she said. Maggie ate slow. Then she looked up with those dark, serious eyes she'd had since she was 6 months old, eyes that always seemed to be working something out, and said, "Are we home?" Eliza didn't answer right away. She pulled the child closer, pressing her lips to the top of her head. "Not yet," she said. "Soon." It was the first lie she'd told her daughter that she wasn't sure she could make true. She tried Mrs. Culver's anyway. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building on the main street, lit up warmly from inside, and Eliza could smell something cooking, beans maybe, and something with fat in it. And for a moment she stood on the step with her hand on the door and let herself believe it might work out. Mrs. Culver was a wide woman with small eyes and a gray bun pulled tight enough to look painful. She looked at Eliza, then at Maggie, then at the suitcase. $4 a night, she said. "In advance. No children under 5. They wake the other boarders." "She sleeps through the night," Eliza said, which was true most of the time. "She won't be any trouble. I only need a few nights, just until I—" $4 a night, Mrs. Culver repeated. "In advance, no exceptions." Eliza looked at her. Mrs. Culver looked back without apology. Eliza picked up her suitcase and walked back out into the cold. She went to 2 other places after that. A saloon whose owner told her they didn't take women with children. A dry goods store where the owner's wife listened to her full story, nodded sympathetically, and then said she was sorry but they just didn't have the room. By the time Eliza made it back to the station bench, Maggie had fallen asleep in her arms again, dead weight against her chest, and the wind had picked up enough to make the overhang creak. Eliza sat down. She set the suitcase at her feet. She looked at the empty tracks going west and the empty tracks going east, and she tried to think of one clear thing she could do next. Nothing came. She had always been good at surviving. That had been her one reliable skill. Not beauty, not luck, not education beyond the basics, but a plain, stubborn capacity for getting through things. She'd gotten through her mother's early death. She'd gotten through a father who drank. She'd gotten through an arrangement with a man named Thomas Monroe, who'd given her Maggie, and then disappeared 3 months into the marriage without a word. She'd gotten through the whispers and the pitying looks, and the landlords who saw a woman alone with a child and calculated risk rather than seeing a person. She had always kept moving. But sitting on that bench with the temperature dropping and Maggie breathing soft and warm against her neck, Eliza Monroe felt something she had refused to feel for a very long time. She felt like she was done. Not angry, not defiant. Just finished, like a lamp that had finally used up the last of its oil. She pressed her cheek to the top of Maggie's head and closed her eyes and thought, I don't know what to do. I actually don't know what to do. And there was something almost peaceful about finally admitting it, and something absolutely terrifying about it at the same time. She heard the horse before she saw the light. It came from the north road, a single horse moving at an unhurried pace, hooves on the hard ground, the kind of steady rhythm that belongs to an animal and rider who know each other well. A lantern swung at the side of the wagon it was pulling, throwing orange light across the dirt. Eliza didn't move. She didn't have the energy to be afraid of one more thing. The wagon slowed as it reached the station. The man holding the reins was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and wasn't particularly bothered by it. He had a hat pulled low, a coat that had seen hard use, and the posture of someone who didn't waste energy on anything unnecessary. He looked at the station, and then he looked at the bench under the overhang, and his eyes settled on Eliza and the sleeping child in her arms. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stepped down from the wagon. Eliza's arms tightened instinctively around Maggie. She wasn't afraid exactly. There was no particular threat in how he moved, but she was wary in the way that any woman alone in the dark with a child learns to be wary. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said back. He glanced at the suitcase, at the bench, at the shawl that was doing its inadequate best to cover a woman and a toddler both. "Train miss you?" he asked. "No?" She paused, not sure how much to say. "I came on the evening train. I just don't have anywhere to go tonight." He looked at her steadily. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Not cold gray, just the color of the sky before rain, the kind of gray that just is what it is without apology. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza Monroe." "Wyatt Callahan." He didn't offer his hand, which she appreciated. She had Maggie in both arms and couldn't have shaken it anyway. "You got anyone you're meeting here? Anyone in Millhaven?" She considered lying. It would have been easier in some ways to make up a story. A husband delayed, a sister expecting her. But she was too tired to maintain a lie, and she didn't have the spirit for it. "I had an arrangement," she said, "with a man named Pratt. He dissolved it tonight. He's already gone." Wyatt Callahan said nothing. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted in his jaw. A small tightening, quickly released. "Pratt," he said, like he was placing the name on a shelf he already had labeled. "Do you know him?" "Know of him." He left it there. Maggie chose that moment to stir against Eliza's chest. She made a small, discontented sound, shifted, and settled again without waking. Wyatt looked at the child for a moment. Just looked, without performance or sentiment. "How old?" he asked. "2," Eliza said. "Just past 2." He nodded slowly. "Where are you going tonight?" he asked. She looked down at the bench. The honest answer was nowhere, and she was too tired to dress it up. "Nowhere," she said. The wind pushed through the overhang, and Maggie shivered even in her sleep, her small body drawing inward. Eliza pulled her tighter, rubbing one hand up and down the child's back through the thin blanket. Wyatt reached into the wagon and pulled out a heavy canvas coat, working gear, worn and smelling like horses and wood smoke, and walked to the bench. He didn't hand it to Eliza. He reached past her and laid it over Maggie, tucking it around the child's back without disturbing her. Maggie exhaled in her sleep. Some of the tension went out of her small shoulders. Wyatt straightened up. "My ranch is 6 miles north," he said. "There's a spare room, stove that works, food in the larder." He looked at her directly. "I'm not offering anything beyond that." Eliza looked at him. She was trying to find the catch. The assumption behind the offer, the thing she'd have to repay, the cost that was always buried in generosity from strangers. She had learned to look for it. She'd been looking for it her whole adult life. She couldn't find it in his face. "Why?" she asked, because she was too exhausted to ask it politely. He considered the question seriously. "Because it's cold," he said, "and that child didn't do anything to end up on a bench in the dark." Eliza felt something move in her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something she'd been keeping carefully sealed for a long time. "I have no money," she said. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to." He picked up her suitcase and walked to the wagon. "Come on before that wind gets worse." She should have thought about it longer. She knew that. Every sensible rule she'd ever been taught about strangers and trust and not putting yourself in debt to people you didn't know. All of it said to stay put, wait for morning, find another way. But she looked at Maggie's face, finally relaxed in sleep under the weight of that coat, and she thought, there is no other way. There is only this. She stood up. She followed him to the wagon. Wyatt Callahan didn't say anything as he helped her up to the seat, just offered a hand, steady and matter-of-fact, and waited until she was settled with Maggie still asleep against her before he climbed up himself and took the reins. He didn't chatter. He didn't try to explain himself or make conversation. He just drove north into the dark, the lantern swinging its circle of light ahead of them, the horse moving at that same unhurried pace it had carried before. After a long while, Eliza heard herself ask, "Did you mean it? What you said? That we'd never sleep outside again?" Wyatt was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I said it," he replied. She didn't know if that was the same thing as meaning it, but it was the most she'd had to hold on to in weeks, and she held on to it. Maggie slept all the way to the ranch, wrapped in a stranger's coat, while her mother sat rigid on the wagon seat beside a man she didn't know, moving through the Wyoming dark toward a place she'd never seen, trying to decide if this was the beginning of something or just one more door that would close before she got all the way through it. She didn't know yet. She just kept moving. That was the one thing she'd always known how to do. The ranch appeared out of the darkness the way things sometimes do in flat country. All at once, no warning, just suddenly there, where there had been nothing. A main house, a barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a fence line that ran off into the black in both directions. No lights burning in the windows. No sound except the wind and the creak of the wagon. Wyatt pulled the horse to a stop near the front door, set the brake, and climbed down without ceremony. He reached up for Eliza's arm, not grabbing, just there in case, and she stepped down carefully with Maggie still against her shoulder, the child stirring now, starting to wake in that confused, unhappy way toddlers do when movement stops, and the world doesn't match what they last remember. "Where?" Maggie started, lifting her head. "Shh," Eliza said. "It's all right." Maggie looked around at the dark, at the unfamiliar shapes of buildings, at the large stranger pulling a suitcase from a wagon, and her face did the thing it always did when she was deciding whether to cry. A kind of gathering, like a sky before rain. Eliza rubbed her back in small circles. The gathering passed. Wyatt had the front door open and a lamp lit before Eliza made it up the porch steps. She stepped inside and stopped. The house was plain. That was the first thing she registered. Not neglected exactly, but stripped down. Everything reduced to what it was for. A table with 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove against the far wall. Shelves with canned goods lined up in order of size. A coat rack with 1 coat on it. A braided rug on the floor that had been nice once and had been walked on honestly since. Everything clean, nothing decorative. It looked like a place that had once had warmth in it and had slowly forgotten how. "Spare room's through there," Wyatt said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "I'll get the stove going." Eliza carried Maggie through the door. The room held a bed with an iron frame, a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror mounted above it, and a window with a flour sack curtain. The mattress was thin, but it was a mattress, and when she set Maggie down on it, the child looked up at the ceiling with those dark working-out eyes and said, "Bed." "Yes," Eliza said. "Soft bed." Yes. Maggie considered this information with the gravity of a small judge and then rolled onto her side and pulled her knees up. Within 3 minutes, she was breathing slow and even, out completely, the way only children and the genuinely exhausted can manage. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her knees and breathed. Through the wall, she could hear Wyatt at the stove, the clunk of the firebox door, the scrape of iron, the small percussion of wood being arranged. A few minutes later, the smell of wood smoke began to seep under the door. Then heat, coming in thin at first and then broader. She sat there until she heard the sounds in the main room go quiet. Then she got up, tucked her shawl around Maggie's shoulders, and went back out. Wyatt was at the table with a cup of something. He'd put a second cup across from him. Coffee, she saw, when she got closer. He didn't make a gesture toward it or tell her to sit. He just left it there. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup. "Thank you," she said. Not for the specific cup. For all of it, which was too large to name without embarrassing herself. He nodded once and looked at his own cup. They sat like that for a while, but not awkwardly, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel the pressure of a silence she needed to fill, but it wasn't that kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a place where silence was ordinary. "How long you been ranching out here?" she asked, not because she needed to know, but because something in her needed to understand where she'd landed. 12 years, he said. "Alone?" He turned the cup slightly in his hands. "My wife passed, 8 years ago now." "I'm sorry. Sorry." "Yeah." He said it the way people say it when they've had enough time to mean it simply, without drama. It was hard for a while. Then it was just the ranch. Eliza looked around the room again. The 2 chairs, the single coat on the rack, the shelves arranged by a person who had learned to take up exactly the amount of space they needed, and no more. "You have hands?" she asked. "Workers?" "2. Brothers. They bunk in the outbuilding. They won't bother you." He paused. "Their names are Dell and Croft. Dell's friendly. Croft less so. That's just his nature, not personal." "All right." She turned the cup in her own hands, mirroring him without meaning to. "Mr. Callahan." "Wyatt." "Wyatt." She took a breath. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not looking for anything. I'm not trying to attach myself to someone's life. I just need a few days to work out what to do next. Where to go. I'll be out of your way as soon as I can manage it." He looked at her across the table, not unkindly, but directly, which she was finding was just his way. "You said you have no money," he said. "Almost none. And no family to go back to." She hadn't told him that, but it was a reasonable calculation. "No." "Then taking a few days to work something out sounds about right." He drank from his cup. "Nobody's asking you to leave on any particular schedule." She studied him. "You don't know me." "No." "I could be—" "I don't know." "Trouble. You don't know what you're letting in." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "You're a woman with a 2-year-old and $4 to your name. I think I can handle whatever trouble comes with that." Eliza surprised herself by laughing. A short, rough sound. Nothing like her normal laugh, but real. She covered her mouth with her hand and the laugh stopped as quickly as it came, but something in her chest had shifted slightly, like a door on a stiff hinge that had moved just enough to let a thread of light through. "Get some sleep," Wyatt said. "We can figure the rest out in the morning." She went back to the spare room, lay down next to Maggie, and was asleep inside 2 minutes. Morning came through the flour sack curtain in gray strips, and Eliza woke to the sound of Maggie already sitting up in the middle of the mattress, eating a cracker. "Where'd you get that?" Eliza said, sitting up fast. "Man gave it," Maggie said, with complete confidence in this arrangement. Eliza swung her legs over the side of the bed. She could hear movement in the main room. Something on the stove, the smell of coffee again, and something else. Bacon, maybe. Real bacon. She smoothed her dress as best she could, ran her fingers through her hair, and opened the door. Wyatt was at the stove, his back to her. He had a skillet going, and he was managing it with the focused, competent attention of someone who had been feeding himself for a long time and didn't consider it anything worth discussing. Maggie was on the braided rug near the table, holding a cracker in each hand, examining them as if they might have different properties. "She woke up before I did," Wyatt said without turning. "Walked right into the kitchen. stood there looking at me. I'm sorry. Don't be. She wanted crackers. I gave her crackers. He moved something in the pan. Eggs in 5 minutes if you want them. Eliza looked at her daughter, who had decided the crackers were equivalent and was eating the left one. Did you say thank you? She prompted. Maggie looked up at Wyatt's back. Thank you, she said very seriously. You're welcome, Wyatt said in exactly the same tone. Eliza sat at the table. She felt disoriented in a way that had nothing to do with the unfamiliar room or the poor sleep. It was the normalcy of the scene that was throwing her. The ordinary, unhurried rhythm of a morning that wasn't a crisis. She had been in crisis mode for so long that the absence of it felt strange. Wrong, almost. Like waiting for the next thing to go bad. The eggs came, the three of them ate at the table. Wyatt and Eliza with forks, Maggie with her fingers, and occasional help. And nobody talked much, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was the closest thing to fine that Eliza had felt in months. Then Del came in. He knocked, which suggested manners, and stuck his head around the door before coming all the way through, which suggested he'd learned to be careful about Wyatt's kitchen. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25 with a wide, open face and the kind of red hair that embarrassed its owner by being visible from distances. Morning. He stopped when he saw Eliza, then Maggie. His expression went through 3 phases in about a second and landed on friendly surprise. Oh, hello. Del, Wyatt said. This is Eliza Monroe. She and her daughter are staying for a while. Spread that around however you see fit, but keep it accurate. Del looked at Wyatt, then at Eliza, then back at Wyatt, and managed, with obvious effort, not to ask any of the questions that were visibly lined up behind his eyes. Nice to meet you, ma'am, he said to Eliza. And you, Eliza said. Del looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at Del. She pointed at his hair. Red, she said. Yeah, Del said, touching the top of his head ruefully. It is. I like it. Del's whole face rearranged itself into genuine delight. Well, he said, that's the nicest thing anyone said to me this week. He looked at Wyatt. Came to ask about the north fence line. After breakfast, Wyatt said. Del went back outside. They could hear him whistling as he crossed the yard. Wyatt looked at Maggie, who had gone back to her eggs. Del likes everybody, he said. This seemed to be a complete statement. And Croft? Eliza asked. Wyatt picked up his coffee. Croft does his job, he said. That's enough. She met Croft an hour later when she went out to the yard to get some air and clear her head while Maggie napped. He was at the water trough, working on something with the pump mechanism. A lean, weathered man in his 30s with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild suspicion toward the world at large. He looked up when she came out. He looked at her the way a person looks at an invoice they weren't expecting. You're the woman Wyatt brought in, he said. Not rude exactly, just blunt. I'm Eliza Monroe, she said. Yes. He went back to the pump. How long you staying? I don't know yet. He worked in silence for a moment. Then, he'd do this before? Bring people in? I wouldn't know, Eliza said. I only met him last night. Croft made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a sigh, the sound of a man recalculating something he'd thought was settled. He's a private man, Croft said. Takes him a long time to let people in, usually. I didn't ask to be let in, Eliza said. I was in a difficult situation. He offered help. I didn't have a better option. Croft looked at her again. She held his gaze steadily, because she had been looked at skeptically by enough people that she'd stopped finding it worth her energy to look away first. He turned back to the pump. I'm not saying anything against it, he said, quieter. Just, he's had a hard time of things. Don't complicate it for him. Eliza thought about that. It wasn't an unfriendly warning when she really listened to it. It was a man who worked for someone he respected, making sure a stranger understood the weight of what she'd walked into. I'll do my best not to, she said. Croft gave a single nod and went back to his work, and that was apparently the end of the conversation. Eliza went back inside. The first 3 days passed in a careful, negotiated quiet. Eliza learned the rhythms of the ranch. When Wyatt woke, which was before the light, when Del came in for his instructions, which was early but never before coffee was ready. When Croft moved between tasks, which was constant, wordless, and efficient. She stayed out of the way. She cleaned the spare room, made the bed tight each morning with military precision, and did the dishes after every meal without being asked. On the second morning, she found the broom and swept the main room floor. Wyatt came in from outside, stopped, and looked at the floor. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He looked like he might argue, and then thought better of it and went to pour his coffee. On the third day, Maggie discovered the barn. Eliza was in the yard when she heard the squeal. Not a scared squeal, a delighted one, and found her daughter pressed up against the lower rail of the paddock fence, reaching both arms through toward a spotted brown horse that was regarding her with large, calm eyes. "Maggie, don't—" "Horse," Maggie said reverently. "Big horse." "Yes, and you don't put your hands near animals. You don't—" "She's all right." Wyatt was behind her. He came up beside Eliza and leaned on the fence, watching Maggie and the horse with a neutral expression. "That's Dolly. She's 20 years old and she doesn't startle. She won't hurt her." Maggie had both hands flat now, pressing them against the side of Dolly's large nose while the horse stood completely still, tolerating this examination with elderly patience. "She seems—" Eliza started. "Gentle," Wyatt confirmed. Maggie turned around with a look on her face that Eliza knew well. The look that preceded a request of significant magnitude. "Can I ride?" Maggie asked. "No," Eliza said. "Maybe," Wyatt said at the same moment. They both looked at each other. "She's 2, Eliza said. "Old enough to sit in front of someone who knows what they're doing," Wyatt said. Not pushing it, just stating a fact. Eliza looked at her daughter's face, which had gone still and bright and completely focused on this possibility the way only a child's face can go. Total concentration, total hope, nothing held back. She thought about all the things she'd said no to over the past 2 years. How many of them had been caution, and how many had been fear wearing caution's clothes? "On the horse right here," she said. "Not out in the field. Right here where I can see." Wyatt nodded. He went and got Maggie himself, lifting her easily, setting her up on Dolly's broad back with a matter-of-factness that made the whole thing seem ordinary and safe, and stood right beside them with his hand on the horse's neck, walking Dolly in a slow circle near the fence, while Maggie gripped the mane with both hands and laughed. Eliza watched from the fence. She hadn't seen Maggie laugh like that, full and unguarded and free, since she couldn't remember when. She turned her face away and blinked hard twice and turned back. On the fourth day, the neighbors started coming. The first was a woman named Ruth Aldridge, who arrived in a wagon with her husband and 2 teenage sons and spent 30 seconds in the yard looking at the house before she knocked on the door. When Eliza answered, Wyatt was out working the fence line. Ruth looked at her with barely concealed assessment. "I heard Wyatt had taken someone in," Ruth said. She was maybe 50, with a broad, capable face and the manner of a woman who ran things. "Wanted to see for myself." "Eliza Monroe," Eliza said. She held the door, neither opening it fully nor closing it. "How long you planning on staying?" There it was, same question as Croft's, different energy behind it. Where Croft had been cautious and almost worried, Ruth's question was territorial, like someone checking a boundary line. "Until I can work out where to go," Eliza said. She had developed an economy with this answer, keeping it flat and unfightable. Ruth looked past her into the house. "Where's the child?" "Sleeping." Ruth looked back at her. Whatever calculation she was doing was complicated, Eliza could tell. She was a woman trying to reconcile what she'd already decided with information that didn't quite fit it. "Gerald Pratt," Ruth said. "That was your arrangement." "Yes." "He's done it before," Ruth said. "Brought a woman out here on a promise and then—" She made a short, tight gesture. "He's not a good man. I want you to know that in case you think what happened to you was a personal thing. It wasn't. It's just what he does." Eliza felt something cold move through her, and then something else. A thin, clarifying anger. Not at Ruth. At the shape of a world where that information existed and hadn't reached her before she'd bought a train ticket. "I appreciate you telling me," she said, and meant it. Ruth studied her for another moment. Then she gave a short nod that seemed to indicate some kind of provisional decision. "I'll send my husband and boys over Saturday to help Wyatt with the east pasture fence," she said. "It's been needing work for 2 seasons. He won't ask for help himself. He never does, but he'll accept it." "That's kind of you," Eliza said. Ruth looked at her hard one more time. Can you cook? She asked. Yes. Properly? Not just heat things up. Yes, Eliza said again. Properly. Ruth nodded once more and walked back to her wagon. Her husband, who had not spoken a single word during any of this, touched his hat brim in Eliza's direction and turned the wagon back toward town. Eliza closed the door. She stood in the main room for a moment, and then she went to the kitchen and started making something for supper that was better than what she'd made the previous 3 nights. Because she'd just decided she was going to stop hovering at the edges of this place and start being actually present in it. Wyatt said nothing when he came in and found the table set and something that smelled like actual food waiting on the stove. He washed up at the basin, sat down, took a bite, and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Ruth Aldridge come by?" Eliza looked up. "How did you know?" "Because the food's better," he said. Not a compliment exactly. Just an observation he was handing her, like information. She felt heat in her face and tried not to show it. "She told me about Pratt, that he's done this before. Brought women out here, and then changed the arrangement." Wyatt's jaw tightened. That same small movement she'd noticed the first night. "Yeah," he said. "You knew that when you found me at the station." "I'd heard things," he said. "Why didn't you say so?" He looked at her. "Would it have helped?" She thought about that. She was sitting on a bench in the dark with a child and $4 and nowhere to go. Would knowing Pratt was a pattern rather than a singular bad decision have helped anything in that moment? "No," she said. "Then that's why." He looked back at his plate. "Doesn't change what happened to you. Doesn't change what you need." She watched him eat for a moment. "What did your wife cook?" she asked. She didn't know why she asked it. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Wyatt set his fork down very briefly, then picked it up again. "Biscuits," he said. "She made good biscuits. Everything else was about the same as mine." "I can make biscuits," Eliza said. "I know you can," he said. "That's not a request." She almost laughed again. She bit the inside of her cheek instead. By the end of the first week, Eliza had stopped feeling like a guest who was overstaying and started feeling like something she didn't have a word for yet. Not at home. It was too early for that, and she wasn't sure she trusted the feeling anyway. But present. She felt present in the place, rather than perched at the edge of it waiting to be asked to leave. She had organized the kitchen, which Wyatt noted without comment. She had mended a shirt she found in a basket near the chest of drawers, left it folded on the table, and said nothing about it. She'd started helping Dell with the chickens each morning, partly to give Maggie something to do. The child was obsessed with the chickens in a proprietary way that seemed to amuse Dell enormously, and partly because it was work, and work settled her in a way that sitting still never had. The problem was that she was also watching herself get comfortable, and that frightened her. She had a history of staying in places because leaving was harder than staying, not because staying was right. She had done it in Cincinnati, stayed in a room she couldn't afford, in a neighborhood that was getting harder, because the alternative was admitting she needed to make a change she didn't know how to make. She didn't want to do that here. She didn't want to become a fixture in a place that had only offered her shelter, not permanence. She was thinking about all of this on the 8th night, sitting on the porch steps after Maggie was down, watching the stars come out in the vast Wyoming sky, when Wyatt came and sat on the step above her. He had coffee. He didn't offer her any, which by now she understood meant he'd assumed she'd help herself if she wanted it. "You're thinking loud," he said. She looked up at him. "What?" "You've got the look of someone doing arithmetic in their head, not the good kind." She turned back to the yard. "I've been thinking about whether I'm staying here because it makes sense or because it's easier than figuring out the alternative." He was quiet for a moment. "Those are different questions." "I know they are." "What would the alternative be, concretely?" She'd been working on this. "The town. Millhaven has businesses. Someone needs help, cleaning, cooking, minding children. I could find a room somewhere. I have enough left to cover a week if I'm careful, and if I start working immediately, with Maggie. I'd bring her with me during the day. Find somewhere. Mrs. Culver doesn't take children under 5. She looked at him. "You know Mrs. Culver." "Everybody knows Mrs. Culver. She's been turning people away for 20 years with great consistency." He set his cup on the step beside him. "The other boarding houses are the same. It's not a town built for women on their own with small children." She'd known this. She'd known it when she'd walked away from Mrs. Culver's front steps 8 nights ago, and she'd filed it away under problems to solve later, and somehow later had not arrived yet. Then I'll solve that part too, she said. I just need time. Nobody said you didn't. He paused. I'm not trying to talk you out of anything. I'm pointing out that the arithmetic you're doing in your head has some numbers missing. She looked at him. He was watching the yard, Dolly visible as a dark shape near the water trough, Dell's light on in the outbuilding. You're a strange man, she said. He considered this. In what way? Most men, if they'd done what you did, brought a strange woman and her child home in the dark, would want something back from it, would keep score, would make sure she knew the weight of what she owed. I told you, he said, you don't owe me anything. I know what you told me. I'm saying, why not? Why doesn't it work like that for you? He looked at the yard for a long time. My wife, he said finally. When she got sick, last year before she passed, someone came out from town, a woman we barely knew. She came out for 3 months, cooked, cleaned, sat with Eleanor when I couldn't, didn't ask anything, just came because we needed it. He picked up his cup. I always figured the only way to repay that kind of thing is to pass it on when you get the chance. Eliza said nothing for a moment. That's a good reason, she said. It's the only one I've got. She started working the ranch properly the following week. Not because Wyatt asked her. He never asked. She had started to learn that asking wasn't a language he used often. But because she woke one morning and decided that whatever this was, she was going to be worth it. She was going to pull her weight so completely that the question of whether she deserved to be here would never have an answer except yes. She took over the kitchen fully. She learned where things were and what needed doing, and she did them before anyone else had to think about them. She helped Croft mend gear when his hands were full, and he said nothing, but he stopped looking at her like an invoice. She learned from Dell which sections of the fence line Wyatt was most concerned about, and she filed the information away and asked smart questions when Wyatt talked through the week's work at the table. And he started answering her as though she were a person who needed accurate information rather than someone to be given a simplified version. She was not good at all of it. She burned 2 batches of biscuits before she got the stove's particular temper figured out. She misjudged a gate latch and let 2 chickens out, which required her and Dell 15, laughing, chaotic minutes to recover. Maggie shrieking with delight through all of it, unhelpfully chasing the chickens in the wrong direction. She went out to help with the livestock one afternoon, slipped in the mud near the water trough, and landed hard on one knee, tearing her skirt and bruising her pride considerably. She limped back inside and changed, and said nothing about it to anyone. What she discovered, working through these weeks, was something she hadn't expected. Wyatt Callahan was watching all of it, not in a way that felt supervising, more in the way of someone who was used to reading a landscape for information, scanning for what had changed, what needed attention, what was working. She'd catch him looking sometimes, from across the yard or through the kitchen window when she was at the stove, and he'd look away without embarrassment and go back to what he was doing, as if noticing were simply a function of how he moved through the world, not particular to her. Or she thought about what Croft had said. He's had a hard time of things. Don't complicate it for him. She thought about Eleanor, the wife whose name she'd learned from that one conversation on the porch steps, the woman who had put this house in order and then been absent from it for 8 years, leaving the kitchen clean but the rooms gradually simplified, the spare chair acquired and never quite filled. She was not Eleanor. She was not trying to be Eleanor. She was Eliza Monroe from Cincinnati, with a daughter who called horses by name and a talent for burning the first batch of anything she attempted in an unfamiliar oven. But she found herself thinking, with increasing frequency, that she didn't want to leave, and she knew she needed to be careful about that. Because want was one thing, and what made sense was another, and she had a 2-year-old daughter who was already calling Dolly by name and following Dell around the yard like a small, determined shadow. And the longer they stayed, the harder leaving would be. For Maggie, and if she was honest with herself, for her own heart too. Then something happened that shifted the whole calculation. It was a Tuesday, 11 days into their stay, and Eliza was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not a fight, more like the particular sound of men talking over each other in a way that meant something had gone wrong. She came to the door. 3 men on horseback she didn't recognize were in the yard. Wyatt was standing between them and the house, his posture completely still in the way it went when he was containing something. Dell was off to the side, watching. Croft had appeared from somewhere near the barn, positioned without appearing to position himself. The man in front, heavy set, with a coat that cost more than anything in this yard, was talking. "Not asking you to put her out tonight, Callahan. Just saying it doesn't look right. Woman nobody knows. Showing up with a kid, no husband, no papers." "She has papers," Wyatt said. His voice was level. "A correspondence contract with Pratt. He dissolved it illegally. She's here while she gets her footing." "People are talking." "People always are," Wyatt said. "That's never been a reason to do anything in particular." The man looked past Wyatt at the house, looked past him at the door, and at Eliza standing in it. She didn't move. She met his gaze through the yard. "Ma'am," the man said, the word arranged to sound polite while carrying the weight of something else. "Mr. she said. "Gaines," he said. "Harold Gaines. I own the Gaines Land Trust, 3 miles east. Eliza Monroe." She stepped out onto the porch. She didn't come down the steps. She just stood there, making herself visible and upright. "I understand you have concerns about my presence here." Gaines looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at nothing. "I don't know your situation, ma'am," Gaines said, "but a woman without a husband and without a clear arrangement puts everyone in an awkward—" "I have a very clear arrangement," Eliza said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her faintly, because her hands were pressed hard against each other behind her back. "I was brought here by a contract that was dissolved by the man who made it, without my consent and in violation of its terms. I am now working for my keep on this property while I determine my options. I am not a burden on this community, and I am not a subject for discussion in this yard." The silence that followed had several things in it. The creak of a saddle as one of the other men shifted. The distant sound of Maggie talking to the chickens somewhere she couldn't be seen. The wind through the yard. Gaines looked at her for a long moment. "You've got a mouth on you," he said. Not aggressively, almost like a statement of fact. "I've needed one," she said. Gaines looked at Wyatt again. Wyatt had the expression of a man watching something he was not displeased about. "Think about what I said, Callahan," Gaines said. Then he turned his horse, and the three of them rode back down the track toward the road. Eliza stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then her knees went slightly unreliable, and she put her hand on the porch post for a moment. When she turned, Wyatt was at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He held her gaze for a moment. The same gray eyes, same steady directness. And she saw something shift in them that she didn't have a name for, something that moved through and settled and left the landscape slightly altered. "Come on," he said. "Lunch." She went inside and made lunch, and her hands had mostly stopped shaking by the time she set the bread on the table. Outside, Dell was telling Croft what had happened, audible through the open window, his voice bright with something very close to pride. Croft's reply was too quiet to hear, but Eliza thought she heard him laugh. Croft did laugh. Eliza heard it clearly. A short, dry sound. Nothing like Dell's open brightness, but real. It was the first time she'd heard it, and it landed on her like an unexpected gift, small and slightly awkward, and completely genuine. She didn't say anything about it. She put the bread on the table and called through the window that lunch was ready, and Maggie came running from the direction of the chicken coop with straw in her hair and both hands dirty, and the afternoon settled into the ordinary rhythm that Eliza was beginning, carefully and with deliberate suspicion of herself, to trust. The days that followed had a different quality to them after the confrontation with Gaines. Not easier exactly. The work was the same, the cold mornings were the same, the awareness that she was still a woman without a clear legal standing in this place pressed on her steadily. Every time she let herself think too hard about the future. But something had shifted in how the people around her held her. Dell had always been easy. Croft had moved, over those first 2 weeks, from watchful skepticism to a kind of gruff acceptance that showed itself mostly in small ways. He started leaving tasks adjacent to where she was working rather than pointedly separate, which she understood from a man like Croft was significant. And Wyatt. Wyatt was harder to read, partly because he had constructed himself to be harder to read, and partly because she had started to notice things she hadn't noticed before, things she would have preferred to keep not noticing. The way he always put more coffee in the pot than he needed for himself without saying so. The way he'd taken to carving in the evenings, small things, nothing useful, the kind of carving that is really just a man's hands needing to do something while his mind works, and leaving the results on the table for Maggie to find in the morning. A horse, a small bear. Something that might have been a rabbit or might have been a dog. Maggie called it a dog with full authority, and the matter was settled. The way he moved through the house when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not like a man in his own space, moving with habit and ownership, but like a man who had remembered that someone else was in the space and was making small adjustments, holding himself differently. She noticed it, and she told herself to stop noticing it. She had enough to manage. 3 weeks in, she went into Millhaven for the first time since the night Pratt had dissolved everything. Wyatt needed supplies, and she offered to go. She needed to see the town properly, map it in her mind, understand what was actually available to her. She left Maggie with Dell, which Maggie received as a wonderful development, and Eliza received as a small private ache, and took the wagon in alone. The town was larger than it had looked on that first night. A main street with some ambition to it, a general store, a bank, a feed and grain, a barber shop, a doctor's office, 2 saloons with that particular frontier combination of optimism and exhaustion in their faces. A post office with a flag that had been fixed since she'd last seen it, the tier someone had repaired with mismatched thread. A few houses behind the main street that were proper houses, fenced, with kitchen gardens in various states of winter readiness. She did Wyatt's errands first. She was organized about it. She'd written his list in order of store, so she wouldn't have to backtrack. And she carried everything back to the wagon before letting herself walk through the town at her own pace. That was when she found the notice board outside the post office. There were the usual things on it: announcements about land filings, a notice about a church fundraiser, a hand-lettered advertisement for a man who did harness repair. And there, in the middle, a piece of paper in a different hand than the others, the ink still dark enough to be recent. Notice? Community concern. It has been brought to attention that persons of uncertain status have been placed at the Callahan Ranch, North Road, 6 miles. The community is invited to consider whether this arrangement is appropriate and what actions, if any, may be warranted. H. Gaines, Land Trust. Eliza read it twice. Her first response was fury, clean, bright, and total. Her second was something colder and more considered. Gaines had posted a community notice. He wasn't done. He'd been turned away from the yard and he'd come at it differently, and whatever he wanted, and she didn't know yet what he actually wanted, which was the part that concerned her most. He was patient enough to work through the community rather than through direct confrontation. She took the notice off the board. A man came out of the post office while she was folding it, mid-50s, with the rolling gait of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, and his body had rearranged itself accordingly. "That's a public notice," he said. "Not threatening, just informational." "I know what it is," Eliza said. "I'm one of the persons of uncertain status it refers to. I'd like to know who gave permission for it to be posted." The man looked at her with careful attention. "Walt Pruitt," he said. "I run the post office. Gaines brought it in yesterday." "Is there a posting policy? Can anyone post anything they like?" Pruitt scratched his chin. "Within reason. Nothing false? Nothing—" He stopped. He was looking at the notice in her hand and then at her face, and she could see him doing the arithmetic. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Eliza Monroe. I came here 3 weeks ago on a contract with Gerald Pratt that he dissolved the same night I arrived. I've been working at the Callahan Ranch while I determine my options. I am not a person of uncertain status. My situation is entirely clear. It was just arranged by a dishonest man." Pruitt looked at the notice. Then he held his hand out. She gave it to him. He folded it once more and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll have a word with Gaines about appropriate use of community notices," he said. "No promises, but—" "That's enough," Eliza said. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." She went back to the wagon. She sat there for a moment before she picked up the reins. Her hands were flat on her thighs and she was breathing deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe through things that wanted to unravel her if she let them. Gaines was going to be a problem. She had understood that from the yard. What she understood now that she hadn't fully grasped then was that the problem wasn't personal. He didn't know her well enough for it to be personal. It was about the ranch, or about Wyatt, or about something in that direction that she didn't have enough information yet to see clearly. She drove back to the ranch and said nothing about the notice until that evening, when Maggie was in bed and she and Wyatt were at the table with the remains of supper between them. "I found something in town today," she said. She described it. Wyatt listened with his coffee in his hands and his expression doing nothing, which by now she'd learned was different from him feeling nothing. When she finished, he set the cup down. "Gaines has been trying to acquire the north quarter of my land for 4 years," he said. "Piece of it sits on top of the only groundwater source for 3 properties in the area. He gets that piece, he controls the water. He's offered 3 times. I've said no 3 times. Eliza looked at him. "And now?" "And now he's got a new angle." Wyatt's jaw was tight. "A woman with no formal standing living on the property. He can use that to push for a review of the deed. Claim there's something irregular about the land use, something that needs investigation. It's thin, but it's enough to be inconvenient." "Inconvenient how?" "A deed review takes months. During that time, certain filings get delayed. Certain improvements I've been trying to register." He stopped. He looked at the table. "I've been trying to register a water rights expansion for 2 seasons. If the deed gets flagged for review, that process stops. Gives Gaines time to file his own claim on the same source." The quiet in the room was different now. Not the comfortable evening quiet she'd grown used to, but something with weight in it. "I'm making it worse for you," Eliza said. It came out flat. She wasn't looking for absolution. She was looking at the facts. "You didn't know," Wyatt said. "That doesn't change it." She was thinking fast. "If I had a clear legal status, if my situation here were more formally documented." "How do you mean?" She looked at him. It was a hard thing to say, not because it embarrassed her, but because it mattered, and she didn't want to say it wrong. "A written work arrangement, a formal contract, witnessed, that establishes that I'm employed here in an official capacity. Not a charity case, not a person of uncertain status, an employee." He considered it. "That would help," he said. "I can write it tonight," she said. "We can have it witnessed in town this week." Pruitt at the post office seemed like a man who valued accuracy. Something moved in Wyatt's eyes. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had expected to carry a problem himself, and had just found someone standing next to him offering to help carry it instead. "All right," he said. "She wrote it that night, by lamplight, at the table." Wyatt read it twice and made one small change, and then signed it, and she signed it, and they folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept his important papers, next to the ranch deed and a small photograph she hadn't looked at, but knew was probably Eleanor. She went to bed. She lay in the dark beside Maggie's warm, sleeping shape and looked at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that writing a work contract was a practical solution to a practical problem, and that was all it was, and she mostly believed it. She got the contract witnessed on Thursday. Pruitt did it without fanfare, stamped it with the post office seal, which was not technically the correct application of a post office seal, but he did it anyway with the air of a man making a point, and kept a copy on file. 2 days later, Ruth Aldridge came by again. This time she came alone, without husband or sons, and she came in the afternoon when Wyatt was out, and only Eliza and Maggie were in the house. She sat at the table and accepted coffee and looked around the kitchen with an expression Eliza was beginning to recognize, the expression of someone revising an earlier opinion and feeling mildly irritated about it. "Gaines is talking to the Prentice brothers," Ruth said. "They own the spread south of here. He's trying to put together enough community voices to call for a formal review." "Of the deed?" "Of the arrangement." Ruth looked at her directly. "Of you, specifically. Whether you're, how did he put it, a stabilizing presence or a complicating one." Eliza felt a spike of something sharp in her chest. She kept her face even. "A complicating presence." "He's not subtle when he thinks he's found an angle," Ruth said, "but he's persistent. I've watched him work this way before." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He got the Morrison family off their east pasture 3 years ago. Didn't do anything obviously illegal, just applied pressure in the right places until it cost them more to stay than to sell." "What do you want from me, Mrs. Aldridge?" Ruth looked at her. The question had been direct, maybe more direct than the situation called for, but Eliza had been in a state of careful internal control since the notice board, and directness was easier than maneuvering right now. "I want to know if you're worth fighting for," Ruth said, with equal directness. Eliza held her gaze. "I don't know how to answer that," she said. "I've been here 3 weeks. I don't have a history with this community. I'm not going to stand in your kitchen, she caught herself, in Wyatt's kitchen, and tell you I'm worth fighting for. That's not for me to say. Ruth sat with that for a moment. What I can tell you, Eliza continued, is that I earn my place here every day, and I have a formal employment contract properly witnessed that establishes exactly what I'm doing here and why. And if Gaines wants to make me a lever against Wyatt's land rights, he's going to find that lever is harder to work than he's counting on. Ruth's expression shifted. That same movement she'd seen on the first visit, the revision irritation resolving into something more like respect. Gerald Pratt, Ruth said, brought 3 women out here in the past 5 years on those mail-order arrangements. You're the first one who pushed back. The others didn't have anywhere to push from, Eliza said. I was lucky enough to find somewhere. Ruth drained her coffee and stood up. I'll talk to the Prentice wives, she said. Mary Prentice runs that household, not Harold. If Mary understands what Gaines is actually after, she won't let Harold sign on to anything. Thank you, Eliza said. Ruth stopped at the door. She looked back at Maggie, who was on the rug with the small carved horse Wyatt had made, walking it in circles with intense concentration. How old? Ruth asked. 2, just past 2. Ruth watched Maggie for a moment. My youngest was 2 when my husband brought us out here, she said. First winter I thought we'd all die. She opened the door. We didn't. She left. Eliza stood at the window and watched the wagon go down the track, and she thought, this is a woman who knows how to survive things. I could learn from her, and she recognized that thought as important. It meant she was thinking forward, not just through. The storm came on a Friday, 3 days later, and it came fast. She had seen the sky changing since morning. That particular flat, yellowish gray that Wyatt had described once, offhandedly, as the color of serious weather. She'd asked Dell about it at breakfast, and he'd said there might be snow by afternoon. By noon, the wind had picked up. By 2 o'clock, it had stopped being a wind and started being a force. Wyatt came in from the north pasture earlier than usual, his coat soaked, his face set in a way that she'd learned meant he was calculating problems faster than he wanted to. It's going to be bad, he said. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. She could hear the barn, could hear the animals through the walls of the house, the sounds going up in pitch and frequency, the way animals do when the air pressure changes and they know something is coming. What do you need? She asked. He looked at her. She was already tying her coat. You don't have to. What do you need? She repeated. He made a decision in about 2 seconds. Dell's already in the barn. Croft's coming from the south line. He'll be 30 minutes behind the weather. We need to get the horses into the back stalls and reinforce the south wall crossbeam. It's been weeks since last spring, and I never got to it before the season turned. He was moving as he talked, pulling on heavier gear. If the temperature drops fast, the water troughs will ice, and the pipes in the main barn could freeze. I know where the pipe insulation is, she said. She did. She'd found it in the third outbuilding during her first week, cataloging things the way she cataloged everything. I can handle the pipes while you do the crossbeam. He looked at her again. Where's Maggie? He said. She was sleeping 20 minutes ago. I'll check. She went to the spare room. Maggie was flat out, deep in an afternoon nap, oblivious to everything. Eliza stood in the door and thought hard about this for 5 seconds. Then she went and got extra blankets and built a wall of them along the side of the bed so Maggie couldn't roll off, tucked her in tight, left the small lamp burning at its lowest, and went back to Wyatt. She's asleep, she said. She'll sleep an hour at least. That's enough time. He handed her a heavier pair of work gloves from the hook near the door. They were his, too large, but they were thick and she put them on. They went out into the storm together. The cold was an immediate physical thing, not like cold air, more like being pushed by something with weight and intention. The wind had real force to it now, driving snow horizontal across the yard. Eliza lowered her head and moved. She knew exactly where the outbuilding was. She'd been to it 40 times in 3 weeks. She got the pipe insulation, heavy rolls of it, awkward under one arm, and made it to the main barn on her second try, the first attempt pushed sideways by a gust that startled her despite herself. Dell was inside with 3 horses that had been brought in from the paddock, all of them nervous and stamping. You don't have to be out here, Miss Eliza, Dell said. I know, she said, for what felt like the 100th time that month. She was beginning to understand that everyone on this ranch had a version of that sentence ready, and none of them fully understood that for her, Having something she could do was not a burden, it was oxygen. She worked the pipes. It was not complicated work, but it was cold work, her fingers going numb inside the oversized gloves, and she moved deliberately and checked each joint twice, because cold and haste together produced errors. The wind found every gap in the barn walls and came through them all at once. From the far end of the barn she could hear Wyatt and Croft. Croft had made it in from the south line, appearing in the barn door at one point looking like a man who had personally argued with the weather and was not pleased with the outcome. The two of them were working the south wall, the sound of hammering irregular against the wind. Dell handled the horses. They trusted him. Even the younger one, who'd been skittish all week, came down to his voice. Eliza finished the last of the pipes, tested the insulation as best she could, and moved to help Dell with the water troughs, breaking the thin ice that had already started to form, scooping it out with a bucket she found hanging near the door. An hour in, the storm got worse. Not steadily worse, suddenly worse, in the way bad weather sometimes does, as though it had been pacing itself and decided to stop. The barn shook. Something outside cracked, a sound like a large thing giving way, and Dell grabbed a support post without thinking. "The east side," Wyatt called from the far end. He appeared from behind the stalls, his hat gone, his face tight. "The overhang on the east side. If that goes, the north corner of the roof goes with it." He was already moving toward the east doors. "The horses aren't all in," Dell said. He meant the south paddock. There were still 2 horses in there, she knew, because Croft had been coming from that direction, and there hadn't been time to get them moved before the storm hit. "I'll get them," Croft said. He was headed for the east doors behind Wyatt. Eliza did the inventory in her head in about 3 seconds. Wyatt on the overhang, Croft going for the paddock horses, Dell with the 3 horses already inside, who were now at peak agitation and could not be left alone. The east doors. She knew them. She'd been through them a dozen times. She knew the layout on the other side, and she knew exactly where the south paddock was relative to the secondary gate. "I know the paddock route," she said to Croft. "You're heavier. You're better on the roof structure if Wyatt needs help." Croft looked at her, half a second. "Second gate's stiff," he said. "You have to lift it while you push." "I know," she said. He turned back toward Wyatt. She went through the east doors. The cold outside the barn was a different country from the cold inside it. The wind had a sound now, not just a feeling. A low, continuous note that was almost mechanical, not natural, the kind of sound that makes something small and old in the human nervous system want to be underground. She put her head down and moved for the paddock. The 2 horses were at the far corner, pressed together, both of them shaking. She got to the paddock gate, lifted and pushed the way Croft had described. The latch was salt-frozen, and it took 2 tries, and got it open. She went inside. She was not Dell. She did not have his ease with animals, that particular quality of calm that moved from him to a horse through contact. What she had was steadiness, a refusal to be panicked, which horses could feel as well as they could feel anything. She talked while she moved toward them. Not soothing nonsense, but a low, continuous, calm string of words. Her own name, Maggie's name, the names of things around her, a plain accounting of what was happening and what she intended to do, and the nearest horse stopped shaking quite so hard and let her reach the halter. She walked them out one at a time, fighting the wind each step, got them both through the barn doors and handed them to Dell, who had the 3rd horse settled enough to spare a hand. "Both of them," she said. Dell looked at her face. "You okay?" "Fine." She was not fine. Her hands were past cold into a kind of burning, and she'd taken a hit from the wind somewhere between the 2nd horse and the barn door that had knocked her sideways into the fence rail and left her ribs sending up strong complaint. But fine was relative. She went back into the barn and heard the sound. It was not a gradual sound. It was the sound of something large deciding to go, and going. A splintering crack that ran the length of the east wall, and then a section of the upper framework dropped 4 inches and stopped, held by something that was no longer what it had been designed to be. Wyatt was under it. She couldn't see him clearly. The lamp inside had swung and the light was wrong, but she could see Croft at the far end of the structure, braced against an upright, and she could see the section that had dropped, and she could see that Wyatt was between where she was standing and where Croft was in the section that had moved. "Wyatt." She said it at a normal volume, which was the right call, but she didn't want to startle anything, including him. "Wyatt, where are you?" "Here." His voice came from behind the dropped section, intact but muffled. "Don't come in. The east joint is still—" "I know about the side entrance," she said. A pause. "What?" She'd found it in her first week, in the course of figuring out the ranch. A low door, never used, set into the east wall behind two old stacked crates. She didn't know what it had been for. Ventilation, storage access, something someone had needed once and forgotten. She'd moved the crates when she was cleaning and noted the door and filed it away. She went to it now. It was at the far end of the east wall, well clear of the section that had dropped. She pulled the crates aside, less weight than she expected, the years had dried them out, and pulled the door. It dragged badly on the floor. She got it open enough and went through low. On the other side, she could see the framework properly. The dropped section was being held by a single remaining crossbeam that was visibly bent. Wyatt was on the far side of it, standing, not injured. She took that in first. The relief was physical, like cold water. But he couldn't get past the section without risk of the crossbeam going. "Back here," she said. "Can you go backward along the east wall?" He turned, clocked the side door, clocked her, and made the calculation quickly. He moved along the east wall, slowly, watching the structure above him. And she moved toward him on the other side, and they met at the door, and she went through first, and he came through behind her, and the moment he cleared the frame, the bent crossbeam let go completely, and the dropped section came the rest of the way down. The sound it made was enormous in the closed space of the barn. Then it was over. They stood outside the side door in the screaming wind, both of them breathing hard, both of them covered in the particular mix of sawdust and hay and cold that a barn produces when it's coming apart. Wyatt's right hand was bleeding from somewhere. Not badly, a cut along the palm, but she could see it even in the low light. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The side door," he said. "I found it the first week," she said, "when I was cleaning." He looked at her for a moment longer. His expression was doing something she couldn't fully read, something that involved more than the immediate situation, something with more history in it than the last 5 minutes. Then he looked at his hand and pressed it against his coat. "Come on," he said. They went back into the barn through the main doors. Croft was there, having made it out through the far end. Dell was there with the horses, all 5 of them now, all standing. Everything that could be done had been done. They stood in the barn and listened to the storm outside, and it was still loud, still violent, but the barn was holding, and the animals were in, and the pipes were wrapped, and the horses were safe, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. Dell was the one who broke it. "That," he said carefully, looking at Eliza, "was something." Croft made the short, dry sound that was his laugh. Wyatt was wrapping his hand with a strip of cloth from the gear shelf, doing it one-handed with practiced efficiency. He didn't say anything. But he looked at Eliza once more across the barn, across the horses and the lamplight and the sound of wind against the walls. And the look lasted long enough that she felt the weight of it even after he turned away. She stood there with burning hands and aching ribs and hair that had come almost entirely out of its pins. And she thought about the spare room with the flour sack curtain and the thin mattress and the work contract in the drawer next to Eleanor's photograph. And she thought about Maggie asleep in the storm with the blanket wall around her. She thought about the side door she had filed away in her memory without knowing she'd need it. She thought, "I did not imagine I would care this much about what happened to the people in this barn. I did not come here to care this much." And she thought, "I am in some kind of trouble that has nothing to do with Gaines." The storm blew for another 6 hours, stripping 2 fence sections flat and taking the east overhang entirely, bending the secondary gate off its post and depositing 4 feet of snow against the north wall of the house. When it was over, when the sound dropped and the pressure in the air changed and the horses finally settled, the damage was visible and real and significant. But everyone was standing. In the morning, Eliza went out to assess with Wyatt and Croft, while Dell stayed inside with Maggie. They walked the property in the thin early light, the snow crunching under every step, and Wyatt itemized what would need to be done in the flat, methodical way of a man who had been dealing with things going wrong for long enough that he'd learned to meet damage with a list rather than a feeling. The east overhang was gone entirely. The barn's south wall had held. The crossbeam they'd reinforced had saved it. 2 sections of north fence were down. The gate was repairable. The pipes had held. At the end of the walk, standing at the north fence line, looking back at the ranch, Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "I would have been under that section," he said. Not dramatically. Just as a statement of fact, the way he stated most things. I know, Eliza said. He looked sideways at her. You knew where the door was. I know where everything is, she said. I made it my business to know where everything is. He held her gaze for a moment. Why? He asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I didn't know how long I was staying, she said. And I thought if I knew the place well enough to be useful, then… She stopped, then started again. I thought it would justify being here. Wyatt was quiet. You didn't need to justify being here, he said. She looked at the damaged fence line. The morning light was coming up pale and cold across the snow, and the ranch looked smaller and more vulnerable than it did in summer light, all the damage clear and specific and real. I did, she said. For myself, if not for you. He seemed to understand that because he didn't argue it. They stood there a minute more, and then Croft appeared from the barn door and called something about the gate mechanism, and Wyatt went back to work, and the morning continued, and Eliza went inside to start breakfast for the people who had stood in a breaking barn the night before and were now still standing. She put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, at the damage and the snow and the clear, cold, honest light of the morning after, and something in her that had been held very carefully for a very long time released its grip a little. Not all the way, but enough. The coffee was too strong that morning, the way it always got when she was distracted and let it sit too long, but nobody complained. Wyatt drank it without comment. Croft drank it without comment. Dell said it was the best coffee he'd ever had, which was a lie so cheerful and obvious that even Maggie looked at him skeptically from her chair. The morning after the storm had a particular quality to it, the kind of exhausted, clear-headed calm that follows something that could have gone worse. The damage outside was visible through the kitchen window in the early light, and they could all see it, and they all knew what the week ahead looked like. And there was nothing useful to say about any of that over breakfast, so nobody said it. What Eliza noticed, eating her own food standing at the counter, because the table only had 4 chairs, and she hadn't worked out how to ask for a 5th without it feeling like a statement, was that the dynamic in the room had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and named cleanly. But it had shifted overnight the way ground sometimes shifts after water moves through it. The surface looked the same, but the weight distribution was different. Croft looked at her differently. That was the clearest version of it. He looked at her the way he looked at Dell. The way he looked at someone whose competence he had personally verified and therefore no longer needed to assess. It was a small thing from the outside. From where Eliza was standing, it was not small at all. She had been here 5 weeks now. 5 weeks of cooking and cleaning and mending and working the animals and learning every board and beam and gate latch on the property. 5 weeks of being careful, being useful, taking up exactly the right amount of space, not too little, which would have been invisible, not too much, which would have been presumptuous. 5 weeks of performing a kind of sustained, deliberate proving. The barn had not required performance. The barn had just required her to know what she knew and do what she could do. That, she thought, was the difference. And she understood now why Croft's eyes had changed. The first neighbor arrived at 9 in the morning. It was Cal Briggs, from the spread 2 miles east, with his oldest son and a wagon loaded with timber. He came around the back of the house to the barn without knocking. Or rather, he knocked on the barn door, which was the correct door to knock on under the circumstances, and found Wyatt already at work on the east overhang framework. Heard the wind last night, Briggs said. He was a large, sun-colored man of about 60, not given to unnecessary words. He looked at the damage. Figured. You didn't have to come, Wyatt said. No, Briggs agreed. He was already unloading timber. His son, maybe 17, built like his father, but still wearing it awkwardly the way young men do, worked without being told. Dell joined them. Croft appeared from somewhere. The reconstruction of the east overhang framework began. Eliza went inside and started making food because 6 men doing heavy work in cold weather would need to eat, and the calculation was simple. By noon, 2 more families had come. The Aldridges. Ruth arrived first before her husband and sons, which told Eliza everything about who had organized this. And then a couple she hadn't met before, a Mr. and Mrs. Farrow from somewhere north of the Briggs property, who brought their teenage daughter and a pot of something that smelled like venison stew. Mrs. Farrow, a compact, direct woman about Eliza's age, with the look of someone who had been making difficult decisions since she was young, came into the kitchen without preamble and set her pot on the stove and said, "I heard about the Gaines notice, the one he put on the post office board." Eliza looked at her. "Word travels. Mary Prentice told the Aldridges. Ruth told me. Mrs. Farrow took the lid off her pot and checked the consistency of the stew with practiced efficiency. "My name is Anne. My husband is a man of very few opinions about other people's business, which I find useful in general and occasionally frustrating when I need him to have one." She looked at Eliza with a directness that was entirely without aggression. "I formed an opinion about Gaines 3 years ago when he tried to reroute the creek that runs through our north pasture. I have not revised it." Eliza set out bread for cutting. "What happened with the creek?" "He didn't get it, because 6 families in this area made it very clear, with witnesses and a registered filing, that the waterway predated his land acquisition and could not legally be redirected." Anne picked up the bread knife and started cutting, which answered Eliza's question about whether she was the kind of woman who waited to be asked. The thing about Gaines is that he works through ambiguity. He finds a situation that isn't clearly defined and he presses on it. The moment you define it clearly, he loses his lever. "I know," Eliza said. "We filed the employment contract." Anne nodded. "Ruth told me." "Good." She cut 3 more slices. "He'll look for another angle." "I know that too." Anne looked at her sideways. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Anne seemed to consider how honest to be and then decided on entirely honest. "Someone frightened," she said. "Someone grateful to the point of being passive. The story Ruth told, woman abandoned at the station, brought in by Wyatt, it sounded like a woman who'd had all the initiative knocked out of her." "It nearly was," Eliza said. She meant it. She was not going to pretend the night at the station bench had been anything other than what it was. Anne nodded, accepting this without drama. "Then you came back from it?" "Yes." "Good, that's more useful." Eliza found that she liked Anne Farrow with the directness of someone who had not had enough straightforward people in her life and recognized one when she encountered her. By mid-afternoon, the east overhang frame was rebuilt, rough, would need finishing work, but structurally sound. The fence sections were a 2-day job, but the men had enough of the material staged that it could be finished before the next weather came through. The secondary gate was back on its post, the mechanism slightly improved from what it had been before. Eliza fed 12 people at the table in 2 sittings. She did it without panic and without any visible sense that this was remarkable, which it was. The kitchen was not designed for 12, the table was not designed for 12, and she had produced enough food for 12 from what had been in the larder, plus what Anne had brought and what Ruth had pulled from her own wagon without being asked. Wyatt helped carry plates. He was not a man who naturally helped carry plates. She could tell that from the slightly effortful quality of his helpfulness. But he did it anyway without being asked, and she appreciated the effort more than the result. After the second sitting was done, and the families were beginning to make noises about the road home before dark, Ruth pulled Eliza to the side of the kitchen with the focused energy of a woman who had something specific to say and a limited window to say it in. "Gaines filed a complaint with the county land office Monday," she said quietly, "about the water rights expansion Wyatt's been trying to register. He cited concerns about the property's current situation." Eliza felt the familiar cold clarity that came when a problem got concrete. "On what grounds specifically?" "He claims there's an unresolved question about whether the current occupants of the ranch constitute a stable operating entity. It's vague enough to be legal and specific enough to cause delay." "Who's the land office agent?" "Man named Schofield. He's not corrupt. I want to be clear about that. He's just meticulous, which Gaines is counting on. Schofield will follow the complaint through proper channels because that's his nature, not because he has any stake in the outcome." "Then we give Schofield what he needs to close the complaint," Eliza said. "Documentation. The employment contract is one piece. What else?" Ruth looked at her with an expression that might, on a less composed face, have been admiration. "A statement from community members attesting to the stable operation of the ranch would carry weight. I can get signatures." "How many do you need?" 6, ideally. 8, to be certain." Eliza looked through the kitchen doorway at the people collecting their coats and their wagons in Wyatt's yard. "You have at least 8 standing in that yard right now." Ruth followed her gaze.
A slow nod. "I'll get the paper from the wagon."
She got 9 signatures. Cal Briggs signed without reading it, on the principle that Ruth Aldridge had asked him to, and that was sufficient. The Pharaohs signed together, Anne's signature larger and more decisive than her husband's. The Aldridge sons signed, Ruth noted, without being asked, which was the moment she decided she'd raise them right after all. Wyatt signed last, standing at the tailgate of Ruth's wagon with the early evening light going orange behind him. He read it fully before he signed, which nobody was surprised by. When he handed the pen back to Ruth, he looked at Eliza. "You put this together," he said. "Ruth and I put it together," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then at Ruth. "Thank you," he said, with the plainness of a man for whom thank you is not a social nicety but an actual accounting. Ruth waved this away. "Get your fence fixed before Thursday," she said. "Another system's moving in from the north." She climbed up to her wagon seat with the efficiency of a woman who had been climbing onto wagon seats for 40 years. "Eliza, come for supper Sunday if you want. Bring the child." She drove out before Eliza could answer, which was, she was learning, Ruth's way of making something a standing offer, rather than a question that could be declined. The yard emptied. The light went down. Maggie, who had spent the day as a sort of benevolent mascot to the assembled workers, Dell had given her a small hammer, and she had spent 3 productive hours hitting things that were already on the ground, was exhausted and had gone quiet in the particular way that meant she was minutes from collapse. Eliza carried her to bed while Wyatt and Croft did a final check of the repaired framework. By the time she came back to the main room, Dell had gone to the outbuilding and the house was quiet. Wyatt came in. He washed at the basin. He sat at the table. She poured coffee and sat across from him. They sat for a while in the way they'd developed over the past 5 weeks. A silence that had earned its comfort, that wasn't avoidance but was instead a kind of shared understanding that not everything needed to be said to be known. Then Wyatt said, "I need to go to the land office." "I know." "Schofield will want to meet with me directly. The documentation helps, but he'll want to see the principal." "When?" "Tomorrow if the road's clear. I'd rather get ahead of it than wait for Gaines to add more to the complaint." Eliza wrapped her hands around her cup. She was thinking about Schofield. Meticulous, Ruth had said. A man who followed process. "Take the original employment contract," she said. "Not a copy. The original with the post office stamp. And the deed. Bring the current deed even if he doesn't ask for it, so he can see the ownership structure is clean. And the signatures Ruth took tonight, all of it in one folder, organized in order of relevance." Wyatt looked at her. "In what order?" he asked. "The deed first. Establish what exists. The water rights application second. Establish what you're seeking. The signatures third. Establish community stability. The contract last. Address the specific complaint directly after you've already shown the complaint is part of a larger picture." She paused. "That way Schofield reads the full situation before he reads Gaines's version of it." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Thought through how to present a case." She hadn't done it formally, but she'd been working out how to get people to see things accurately since she was about 16, which was when she'd learned that the world's default understanding of her situation was never going to be the correct one. "Not formally," she said. "Just practice." "I'll take all of it," he said. "In that order." She nodded. Then he said quieter, "You should come with me." She looked up. "To the land office," he said. "You're on the contract. Schofield will have questions about the employment arrangement, and I'd rather he hear the answers from the person who wrote it." This was practical reasoning. She knew it was practical reasoning. She also knew it was something else, or at least that there was something else adjacent to it, but she made the decision not to examine that closely right now. "All right," she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood up and put the cup in the basin and went to bed, and Eliza sat at the table alone in the kitchen for a while, in the dark that was lit by the last of the lamp and the moonlight coming through the window on the new snow, and she thought about what it meant to have someone ask her to stand beside them on something important, not stand behind, not stand in front, beside. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Tut. Millhaven looked different in daylight for the second time. It looked like a town that was trying to become something, not quite there yet, not quite settled into what it was going to be. still in the awkward middle stage between frontier outpost and actual community. She noticed things on this trip she hadn't seen the first time. A schoolhouse at the far end of the main street that was small but had glass in both windows. A garden behind the doctor's office that someone had planted with intention, now winter bare but staked and planned. A child's ball in the mud near the general store that someone would come back for. Signs of people who expected to stay. The land office was at the end of a side street, a plain building with a sign so weathered it was almost illegible. Inside, it smelled like paper and iron and the particular dry warmth of a room with a working stove and no ventilation. Schofield was younger than Eliza had expected. 35 at the most, with careful eyes behind round spectacles and the desk manner of someone who considered accuracy a moral position rather than a professional one. He stood when they came in. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I was expecting you." "Not surprised," Wyatt said. He shook hands. He gestured to Eliza. "This is Eliza Monroe. She's employed at the ranch. The complaint filed by Gaines names her situation as the basis for concern, so I've brought her." Schofield looked at Eliza. He had the focused look of a man cataloging. "Miss Monroe." "Mr. Schofield." She set the folder on his desk. She didn't open it. She let him do that. He sat down. He opened it. He went through the contents in the order she'd arranged them, reading each document with his lips just slightly pressed together, which seemed to be his reading expression. He did not rush. He did not make sounds. He read with the full attention of a man who understood that paperwork mattered precisely because it outlasted the people who made it. When he finished, he set the folder down flat. "The employment contract is properly witnessed," he said. "Yes," Eliza said. "You wrote it yourself?" "Yes." "You have legal background?" "No, I have a clear understanding of what I'm doing here and what Mr. Callahan is providing in return, and I wrote that down accurately." Schofield considered her. "The complaint suggests the arrangement is ambiguous." "The arrangement is not ambiguous," Eliza said. "The arrangement was made ambiguous by the framing of the complaint, which I understand is Mr. Gaines's method." A small, very controlled reaction crossed Schofield's face. Not a smile. Something more careful than a smile. "I'm not in a position to speak to Mr. Gaines's methods." "Of course not," Eliza said. "I'm speaking to the substance of the complaint, which is that my presence at the ranch destabilizes it. I'd suggest the documentation in front of you, and the 9 signatures from community members who were at the ranch yesterday rebuilding storm damage speaks to that directly." Schofield looked down at the signatures. He looked at them for longer than strictly necessary. "The water rights application," he said. He looked at Wyatt. "You filed this in August." "Yes," Wyatt said. "Mr. Gaines filed a competing interest in the same water source in October." Eliza had not known that. She kept her face even, but she felt Wyatt go still beside her in the way he went still when information landed that he'd been half expecting and had hoped not to receive. "That's the first I'm hearing of a competing interest," Wyatt said. Schofield looked at him over the spectacles. "It was filed quietly. It's within the legal window." A pause. "It's also arguably in conflict with your prior filing, which gives your August application precedence, but only if the August filing stands without complication. The complaint gives me grounds to flag the August application for review, which pauses it, during which time the October filing by Gaines advances." The room was quiet. "How long is a review?" Eliza asked. "Minimum 90 days, Schofield said. Potentially longer." 90 days. By the end of 90 days, Gaines could have the water rights claim advanced far enough that even a clean resolution of the review wouldn't give Wyatt's application clean precedence. She could see the architecture of it now, the notice board, the yard visit, the complaint, all of its steps in a structure designed to buy Gaines those 90 days. She thought for a moment. "Can the review be expedited?" she asked. Schofield looked at her. "Under what grounds? If the complaint can be demonstrated to be without substantive basis, can the review period be shortened, on the grounds that the complaint itself was filed for purposes of delay rather than genuine concern?" Schofield took his spectacles off. He cleaned them with his handkerchief. He put them back on. This seemed to be how he processed something that required thought. "If the filing party could be shown to have made a bad faith complaint," he said slowly, "that would constitute grounds for expedited resolution. But demonstrating bad faith requires evidence of intent. Gaines has done this before, Eliza said. The Morrison family. 3 years ago. Is there a record of that filing? Schofield was still. I'd need to look. We can wait, Eliza said. Wyatt looked at her sideways. Schofield looked at her for a moment longer, then stood up and went to the filing cabinets behind him. He was gone for 11 minutes. Eliza counted. Wyatt sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his jaw doing its quiet tightening. When Schofield came back, he had a folder. He set it on the desk. He did not open it in front of them. There is a prior filing, he said, approximately 3 years ago. The Morrison property. A complaint was filed that precipitated a deed review. The review ran for 4 months. During that time, a Gaines Land Trust interest in an adjacent water source advanced past a competing filing. He paused. The Morrisons sold before the review concluded. Nobody said anything. That is a pattern, Schofield said. He said it carefully, like a man stating something he was aware had weight. Yes, Eliza said. Schofield looked at the folder, then at Wyatt's folder, then at Eliza. I'll need 3 days, he said. I want to review both the Morrison filing and the current complaint against the standard of good faith requirements before I make any determination. He closed Wyatt's folder and handed it back across the desk. I'd recommend Mr. Callahan keep the originals in a secure location. These documents are in order. Wyatt took the folder. Thank you, Schofield. Don't thank me yet, Schofield said. Come back Thursday. They walked out of the land office into the cold, bright air. On the street, Wyatt stopped walking. Eliza stopped beside him. He looked straight ahead at nothing particular for a moment. Then he said, The Morrison filing. How did you know about that? Ruth mentioned the name when she told me Gaines had a history of working through pressure, she said. I didn't know about the specific mechanism. I guessed that if Schofield was a thorough man, he'd have a record of it. Wyatt was quiet. That was a risk, he said, asking him to look. Yes, she said, but the alternative was taking 90 days with our hands behind our backs, and I didn't see the point in that. He looked at her then. The full, direct look, the gray eyes that didn't perform anything, that just looked at what was there. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Finding the thing I haven't thought of yet, the side door. He paused. Now this. She held his gaze. She could have deflected. She was practiced at deflecting. I pay attention, she said. That's all. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked back at the street. I need to get wire for the fence, he said. Come with me or wait in the wagon, whatever you'd prefer. I'll come, she said. They walked down the main street together, and it was not lost on her that people saw them, that they registered as a unit to the people they passed, a man and a woman walking together with purpose, and that this was different from how she had walked through this town 5 weeks ago, alone and without direction, with everything she owned in a suitcase and nowhere to put any of it. She did not know what to do with that difference. She filed it. Thursday came. They went back to Schofield. He had done the review. He told them so plainly, sitting across his desk with both folders open in front of him, his spectacles precisely aligned on his face. The Morrison filing shows a pattern of complaint use that is materially similar to the current case, he said. In my determination, the current complaint does not meet the good faith standard required for triggering a formal deed review. I am dismissing it. He looked at Wyatt. Your August water rights application will proceed without interruption. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Gaines's October filing? He asked. Stands, Schofield said, but it's secondary to your August precedents. Absent the delay the complaint would have bought, his filing does not advance past yours. The room was quiet. He'll file again, Eliza said. Not a question. Probably, Schofield agreed, but he'll need new grounds, and I'll be watching for similar patterns. He closed both folders. That's all I'm prepared to say about it. They thanked him, properly this time, and went back to the wagon. The drive home was mostly quiet. The road north was rutted from the storm, and the wagon required attention. Halfway back, the sun came out from behind the cloud cover that had been sitting on the valley for 3 days, and the snow on the fields went bright and white in a way that made Eliza squint. It's going to be all right, Wyatt said. She looked at him. The ranch, he said, the water rights. It's going to be all right. I know, she said. He was looking at the road. I wasn't sure for a while. After Eleanor died, There were a few years where I wasn't sure the ranch was going to survive me. He said it flat, the way he said things that mattered, not the land. The land doesn't need much, but the point of it, what it's for. Eliza looked at the road ahead. What did you decide? She asked. I didn't, he said. Not for a long time. I just kept working it and waited to see if the point came back. She thought about that. Did it? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. It's coming back, he said. She kept her eyes on the road. She felt the weight of those words sitting in the wagon between them. Not uncomfortable, just present. Real. The kind of real thing you don't pick up and handle right away, but you acknowledge with your whole attention. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The wagon moved north through the snow. The weeks that followed, Schofield's ruling had a different texture. Not easier in terms of work. If anything, the repair work from the storm, plus the regular winter ranch operations made the days long and physical in ways that reminded Eliza of muscles she hadn't known she had. But the pressure that had been sitting over the ranch since the notice board and the yard visit had lifted, and in its absence the days felt like they belonged to the people living them rather than to Gaines's calculation. Maggie turned 2.5 somewhere in that stretch, unmarked by any official date but noticeable in the rapid way of toddlers. One week she was a child who needed carrying when the ground was uneven, and the next she was navigating the yard with stubborn independence, informing everyone she encountered about the status of the chickens, the horses, and what she had eaten for breakfast. Dell was her favorite person. This was clear and unambiguous, and Eliza had made her peace with it, because Dell's delight in Maggie's company was so genuine and uncomplicated that it was impossible to feel anything about it except grateful. He'd started teaching her the names of tools, not because a 2-year-old needed to know the names of tools, but because Maggie had asked and Dell was constitutionally incapable of refusing an earnest question. Croft, who had never in Eliza's observation shown particular feeling in any direction toward anything, had been observed twice sitting on the fence watching Maggie talk to the horses with an expression on his face that could only be described as fond. He had not acknowledged these observations, and Eliza had not raised them. Wyatt carved. He carved more now than he had in the early weeks. Not just small things for Maggie, but larger pieces, more considered. A small wooden box with a fitted lid that appeared one morning on the kitchen shelf. A repair to the broken chair rung that had been bothering Eliza since week 2, done with such precision that the joint was stronger than the original. He did these things without announcement and without waiting to be thanked. She noticed. On a Sunday in late November, she went to the Aldridge farm for supper as Ruth had standing invited her. She brought Maggie and a pie she'd made from dried apples because it was what she had, and she wasn't going without bringing something. Ruth received the pie with the manner of someone who expected it and set it immediately in the center of the table, which Eliza read as respect. There were other people at supper. The Farrows, an older couple named Vance, who had been in the area since before Millhaven was a town, a young man who was some relation of Ruth's that Eliza didn't quite track. The table was large and loud and food-centered in the way of people who understood that meals were infrastructure. At some point after the main food and before the pie, Ruth leaned over and said quietly to Eliza, "He came to help with the fence, you know." "Who?" "Wyatt. Thursday. 2 days after Schofield's ruling. He came out with Croft and they spent the day on my east fence line. Didn't say why." Ruth picked up her coffee. "He hasn't done that in about 4 years." Eliza looked at her cup. "He doesn't ask for help, but he pays it," Ruth said. "Always has. When Eleanor was sick, he stopped for a while, just contracted. Came back to himself eventually, but slowly." She looked at Eliza directly. "He's less contracted now than he was in September." Eliza didn't answer. "I'm not pushing," Ruth said. "I don't do that. I'm just saying what I see. Because I think you see it too and you've decided not to look at it, and I understand why. But I don't think not looking at things ever made them simpler." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I have a daughter," she said, "and no formal standing in that house, and a history of staying in places because leaving was harder than staying, which I am actively trying not to repeat." "Those are all real things," Ruth said. "Yes. None of them are the same as the thing you're not looking at." Eliza looked at her. Ruth had the expression of a woman who had been right about things before and had learned to say so without being insufferable. "No," Eliza admitted. "They're not.
Ruth picked up her fork. "Pie," she said, and cut the first slice.
She thought about what Ruth had said on the drive back. Maggie was asleep in the wagon seat against her arm, one small hand fisted in the wool of Eliza's sleeve, the way she'd slept since she was an infant. The night was cold and clear, the stars overwhelming in the Wyoming dark the way they always were when the cloud cover broke. Wyatt had kept the lamp on in the kitchen. She could see it from the track, that single warm window against the dark of the house. He'd done that most nights. She'd noticed it after the second week and understood it wasn't accidental. It was a light left on for someone coming home. She sat in the wagon in the cold for a moment after she stopped the horse, looking at that window. She thought about the side door she'd found in the first week. She thought about sitting on the station bench with a sleeping child and $4.60 and a shawl that wasn't warm enough. She thought about the way people spent their whole lives trying to get to a place they could call theirs, and how sometimes you planned for it your whole life and ended up somewhere wrong. And sometimes you arrived at it sideways through a disaster and a stranger and a barn that came apart in a storm. She thought, I am tired of trying to decide when to trust this. She picked up Maggie and carried her inside. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was on the table. There was coffee in the pot, still warm. He hadn't been in bed long. She settled Maggie in her bed and came back out to the kitchen and poured herself a cup and sat at the table. She sat there for a while. Then she heard Wyatt's door and he came out in the way people do when they haven't been sleeping, without surprise, moving with a kind of resigned wakefulness. And he saw her at the table and didn't say anything, just went and poured his own cup and sat across from her. The lamp was between them. Ruth says you fixed her east fence Thursday, Eliza said. Needed doing, he said. She seemed to think it was about more than the fence. Wyatt looked at his cup. Ruth thinks a lot of things. She's usually right, though, Eliza said. He looked up at her. She held his gaze and didn't do any of the things she would have done a month ago. Didn't look away. Didn't find something to qualify. Didn't put the conversation somewhere safer. She was tired of safe. She had been managing herself carefully for so long that she had started to feel like someone she'd invented rather than someone she actually was. I don't know what we're doing, she said. I don't know what this is. And I'm not asking you to name it or to promise anything. I know what promises cost when they don't get kept. But I've been pretending I don't know what I feel when I'm in this house, and I'm tired of pretending it. The kitchen was very quiet. Wyatt set his cup down. What do you feel? He asked. His voice was careful, not guarded. Careful. The way you are with something that matters enough to be worth the care. She thought about how to answer honestly. Like I'm where I'm supposed to be, she said. Which terrifies me because I've been wrong about that before, and I have Maggie to think about, and I know that's not the same as knowing what to do about it. She stopped. But you asked what I feel. That's what I feel. Wyatt was quiet for a moment that had real weight to it. Eleanor, he said, when I lost her, I thought that was the end of that. A feeling like I was pointed at something, not just working. He was looking at the lamp. I thought that just happened once, and if you lost it, it was gone. She waited. I was wrong about that, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most full silence she had ever sat inside, full of everything that was being said without words, everything that would eventually need words but didn't yet, everything that was true and present and entirely without promise, because neither of them were people who made promises lightly. Maggie made a small sound in the spare room, just a sleeping sound, a shift and a sigh, and they both heard it, and something in both their faces changed slightly, softened. She called Dolly by name again today, Wyatt said. She's been calling Dolly by name for 3 weeks, Eliza said. She called Croft by name today. Eliza blinked. How did he take that? He told her she had the right horse. A pause. Then he went and found her a carrot to give the horse. Another pause. He told her it was for the horse. She ate half of it herself. Eliza pressed her lips together. She was not going to laugh. She laughed. It came out real and full and not at all careful, and across the table Wyatt made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh too. Real, a little rough, the sound of something that hadn't been used quite enough recently. Maggie slept through all of it, deep and warm and entirely at home in the room she'd lived in for 5 weeks.
and treat it as hers since the first morning she'd walked into the kitchen and demanded crackers from a stranger.
Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold and enormous, and the lamp burned steady between them, and nothing was resolved or promised or named. And that was all right, because the night was long and the coffee was still warm, and they were both, for the first time in a long time, in no particular hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. The lamp burned down some time before either of them moved. Eliza noticed it first, the light going amber and lower, the wick needing attention. And she got up and trimmed it without thinking, the way you do things in a place you've learned by habit. And when she sat back down, the light was steadier, and Wyatt was watching her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of saying something without saying it. "I should sleep," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for another few minutes. Then she went to bed, and she lay in the dark beside Maggie's warmth and looked at the ceiling and did not try to solve anything. She just let it be what it was, complicated and real and not yet named. And eventually she slept, and the night passed, and morning came in through the flour sack curtain the same as always. December arrived without ceremony. The ranch work contracted the way it always did in deep winter. Less to do outdoors, more to maintain, a different quality of labor that was about holding what you had rather than building toward anything new. The days were short, and the nights were long, and the kitchen became the center of everything, the place where the day started and ended, where Maggie held court over her carved animals, and Dell appeared for coffee with reliable cheerfulness, and Croft came in for meals with the slightly improved expression of a man whose life had recently been made more orderly without his having to ask for it. Eliza baked bread every other day because she'd learned that was the rate at which it disappeared. She kept the stove fed and the kitchen clean and the larder inventoried, and on the days when the outdoor work allowed it, she sat at the table in the afternoons and did the ranch accounting. Wyatt had handed her the ledger one evening without preamble, saying only that she was better at numbers than he was, and that she'd see why when she looked at the last 3 years of entries. And she had looked, and she had seen, and she had spent 2 weeks quietly reorganizing 4 years of records that were accurate but impenetrable and produced a system that made sense. He did not say thank you for this. He said, looking at the new ledger, "I can actually read this," which from Wyatt was the same thing. The water rights ruling came through from Schofield on the 14th of December. Written confirmation, stamped, formal. The Callahan August filing was confirmed as primary. The Gaines October filing was recorded as secondary and would not advance while the Callahan claim remained active. The complaint had been formally noted in the county record as dismissed for insufficient basis. Wyatt read it twice at the table. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer with the deed and the employment contract and Eleanor's photograph. "That's done then," he said. "That part of it," Eliza said. He looked at her. He knew what she meant. Gaines would find another way eventually, or he wouldn't, and either way the ranch would deal with it. That was not pessimism. That was just the accurate understanding of how things worked on the frontier, where nothing was ever finally resolved, only currently managed. "That part of it," he agreed. She poured him coffee and he drank it, and they talked through the week's work, and it was ordinary, and she had learned by now that ordinary was not nothing. Ordinary was what you got to have after the hard things. It was the reward that didn't look like a reward because it didn't come with ceremony, just with the quiet daily proof that you had made it through. Gaines came one more time. She hadn't expected it to be so direct. She'd expected another layer of paperwork, another complaint filed through some channel she'd have to locate and address. Instead, on a Thursday morning in mid-December, he arrived at the ranch himself. Alone, this time. No riders. Just Gaines in his wagon with his expensive coat and his land trust and whatever calculation he'd been running since Schofield's ruling had closed the door he'd spent months building toward. Wyatt was in the barn. Eliza was on the porch with a basket of mending when she saw the wagon coming up the north track. She set the mending down. She did not go inside. She did not call for Wyatt. She stayed on the porch and watched Gaines come, and when his wagon stopped in the yard, she was standing at the top of the porch steps with her arms at her sides, and her face arranged around the understanding that this conversation would be what she made it. Gaines looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment of a man who'd expected a different configuration. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Mr. Gaines." She kept her voice even. "Wyatt's in the barn. I can get him. Or you can tell me what you came to say." He studied her for a moment. Then he climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard. And she noticed that without the three riders behind him, he was just a heavy-set man in a good coat, no longer a threat in formation, but a single person with a problem he hadn't solved. "The Schofield ruling," he said. "Yes. I'm not here to contest it." She waited. Gaines looked at the house, at the repaired east overhang, at the yard, which was orderly, everything where it belonged, the fence lines tight, the animals visible and settled in their paddock. "I've been doing this a long time," he said. He didn't say it with self-pity or with pride. He said it the way a man states a fact about himself that he's been looking at sideways for a while and has just turned to face directly. "The Morrison family. They tell you I'm a hard man." "Are they wrong?" Eliza asked. His jaw shifted. "No." A pause. "I want the water source. I've wanted it for 4 years. That part's not going to change." "Then we understand each other," she said. "What I'm saying—" He stopped. He looked at her. "What I'm saying is I can see when a position has been held. I came here because I thought the hold was weak. I was wrong about that." He looked at the house again. "I'm telling you I was wrong about it. I'm not saying I'm done wanting the water source. I'm saying I'm done going about it the way I've been going about it. It's not—" He stopped again, and she had the unusual experience of watching a man who'd spent a long time doing a thing confront the word for what that thing was, and find he didn't want to say it out loud. "You don't have to say it," she said. "Decent," he said anyway. "It's not decent." The yard was quiet. In the paddock, Dolly made a sound, just a horse sound, nothing particular. And the two younger horses shifted and settled. "What do you want, Mr. Gaines?" she said. "Not the water rights, right now, today." "What did you come here to get?" He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "I came to see if it was real," he said. "What Schofield said. Whether this place was actually what the documentation said it was, or whether it was just paper." She opened her hand slightly. A gesture at the yard, the house, the repaired overhang, the orderly evidence of a working ranch with people in it who intended to stay. "What do you see?" He looked for a long moment. "Something that's going to be harder to move than I thought," he said. Not a compliment, just an assessment from a man who'd spent his life accurately calculating what was and wasn't movable. "Then you have your answer," she said. He looked at her one more time. Then he climbed back onto his wagon. He turned the horses back toward the road, and halfway down the track he stopped once and looked back. She was still on the porch. He held her gaze for a moment, then faced forward and drove away. Wyatt appeared from the barn door. He'd come out somewhere in the middle of it. She didn't know exactly when, but she could tell from the set of him that he'd seen enough. He crossed the yard and stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "He'll file again eventually," Wyatt said. "Different angle." "Maybe," Eliza said, "but not today. And today is the one I had." Wyatt looked at her. That particular look she'd stopped trying to translate because it had too many things in it for any one word to cover. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." She came inside. Christmas came to the ranch the way it came to most working places on the frontier, practically without much decoration, marked more by the quality of the meal than by any ceremony. Ruth Aldridge sent a basket. Ann Farrow sent a jar of something preserved that turned out to be the best thing Eliza had eaten in years. Dell appeared with a paper packet of sugar candy that he said was for Maggie, but that he clearly also intended to eat some of, and nobody commented on this arrangement. Wyatt gave Maggie a carved horse on Christmas morning. Not a small, rough one like the early carvings, but a detailed piece, the legs articulated, the mane suggested by careful fine cuts, the whole thing sanded smooth. He set it on the table while Maggie was still eating her breakfast, and she looked at it for a full 10 seconds in silence, which was remarkable for a child who usually produced commentary on everything within 2 seconds of encountering it. Then she picked it up with both hands and held it against her chest. "Mine," she said. "Yours," Wyatt confirmed. She looked at him with those serious dark eyes. "Thank you, Wyatt," she said, with the deliberate formality of a child who has been taught to say thank you properly and is applying that teaching at full strength. "You're welcome, Maggie," he said, in exactly the same tone he'd used the morning with the crackers. Eliza was at the stove. She kept her face toward it. She gave Wyatt a pair of gloves she'd sewn herself from a piece of heavy leather she'd bought in town and worked every evening for 2 weeks in the lamplight after Maggie was asleep. She'd patterned them from tracing his working gloves while he was outside, which had involved a certain amount of logistics. They weren't perfect. The right one was slightly tighter across the knuckles than she'd have liked, but they were his size, made for his hands specifically, which was the point. He tried them on. He flexed his hands in them, testing the fit. "The right one's a little," she started. "They're right," he said. She started to say something else, and he looked at her, and she stopped. "They're right," he said again. She looked down at the stove. He wore them all day. January was hard. January is always hard on the Wyoming frontier. Not dramatic, just steady and cold and long. The kind of difficult that doesn't give you a crisis to fight through, just days to get through one at a time. The water troughs iced every morning. The horses needed checking twice a day. The roads were unreliable, and they were largely on their own out there on the North Road, which was both the fact of frontier life and, Eliza had come to understand, something she no longer minded. She had not expected that. She had expected to find the isolation wearing. She'd grown up in a city, in close quarters, with noise and neighbors and the constant low-level awareness of other people. She had thought the silence of the ranch would eventually press on her. Instead, it had become one of the things she depended on. The particular quality of the quiet out here, which wasn't really quiet at all but was full of sounds that made sense, that were proportionate, that didn't demand anything from her. She wrote a letter to a woman she'd known in Cincinnati. Not a close friend, but a decent one, the kind you lose track of without meaning to, and described the ranch and the work and the winter, and the way Maggie had taken to frontier life with a completeness that suggested she'd been waiting for it. She did not say everything in the letter. She said enough. The letter came back 3 weeks later with an addition at the bottom, in her friend's handwriting. "You sound different. You sound like yourself." She folded it and put it in the drawer of the chest in the spare room, next to the small wooden bear that Maggie had demoted from favorite toy to treasured object, which was its own kind of promotion. The conversation she had been not quite having with Wyatt since the November night in the kitchen was still not quite happening in the direct sense. They hadn't sat down and named things, hadn't made declarations or decisions, hadn't done any of the formal things that people did when they were arranging something permanent. But it was happening in every other way. In the way he consulted her on ranch decisions without making it a consultation, just talking through a problem at the table until they'd worked it out together. In the way she'd stopped thinking of the kitchen as his kitchen and started thinking of it as the kitchen. In the way Maggie called him by his name without any title attached, and he answered without any hesitation, as if it had always been that way. She was aware that what they were building had a shape she recognized. She was also aware that neither of them was in a hurry to formalize it, and she'd spent enough time being afraid of that instinct, reading it as avoidance, as failure of commitment, to understand now that it wasn't. It was care. It was two people who'd both been hurt by things ending badly, making sure that what they were starting was real enough to hold before they put weight on it. The weight would come. She knew that. The moment would come when something would need to be said directly, some arrangement made formally, not for themselves but for Maggie, for the legal shape of things, for the world outside their kitchen that required documents and definitions. She was not afraid of that moment. She was just not rushing it. It came in February, not dramatically but practically, as most real things did. Wyatt came in from a ride to the South Line one afternoon and sat at the table with his coat still on, which meant he'd come in with something on his mind that he hadn't finished working out yet. Eliza was in the kitchen. She let him sit. After 5 minutes, she brought coffee. After 5 more, he said, "I went past the South Marker today." She sat down across from him. "And?" she said. "And there's good land down there, flat, good drainage, protected from the north wind by the ridge. I've been thinking about building out there. A second structure, something—" He stopped. "Something more." She looked at him. "More than what?" she said. He looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands, the hands in the gloves she'd made, which he'd worn every working day since Christmas, and which had broken in now to the particular shape of his grip. "More than a spare room with a flour sack curtain," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about the spare room, the thin mattress, the cracked mirror, the way she'd lain on that mattress the first night and been unable to believe that kindness could be that simple and that unconditional, and the way she'd slowly, over months, learned that it could, that some things were exactly what they appeared to be, and that appearing to be good and being good were not always different things. She thought about Maggie, who had never in her conscious memory had a room of her own, or a yard of her own, or a horse whose name she knew. She thought about what it meant to be asked, not told, not assumed, not taken for granted, but asked to have more. "That's not just a building project," she said. He looked up at her. "No," he said. She held his gaze. "You're asking me something." "Yes." "Then ask it," she said plainly. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know what to say. She understood that now she'd learned to read the quality of his silences, but because he was a man who took words seriously enough to want to say the right ones. "I'm asking if you want to stay," he said. "Not as an employee, not on a contract." A pause. "As this, what this is, whatever we call it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the station bench in the dark, about Pratt's turned back, about $4.60 and a shawl that wasn't warm enough, and a child who'd asked if they were home yet, and been told not yet, soon, which had been the most honest lie she'd ever told. She thought about side doors, about the Morrison filing, about 9 signatures on a piece of paper outside in a frozen yard, about a laugh she hadn't planned on a cold night in a warm kitchen, and the way it had come out real. She thought about what home actually was, not a place that was given to you or arranged for you or promised to you by someone whose promises dissolved faster than the prairie wind. Home was a thing you built from work and time and the specific decision made over and over without ceremony to be present in a place rather than just occupying it. She had been building it here. She hadn't let herself use the word, but she had been building it anyway, the way you build things that matter. Not all at once, but daily, with whatever you have, imperfectly, and with full effort. "I want to stay," she said. He exhaled, small, controlled, but she saw it. "Maggie, too," she said. "I wasn't going to suggest otherwise," he said, with the slight, almost dryness that she'd come to understand was as close as he got to warmth in his voice when he was feeling too much of it. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together. "We'd have to make it legal at some point," she said. "For Maggie's sake. For the land records. Schofield will need—" "I know," he said. "We can do that in the spring, when the roads are better." He looked at her. "If that's acceptable." "That's acceptable," she said. He nodded. She nodded. And then, because they were both practical people who had just arranged something significant and who also had a ranch to run and a child who would be awake from her nap in approximately 20 minutes. They finished their coffee and Eliza went back to the stove and Wyatt went back outside to finish the South Line assessment, and the afternoon continued on its axis as if nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. The kind of shift you don't feel in the moment because it happens in the deepest part of you, in the part that has been braced for a long time and has finally, quietly, stood down. Spring came the way it always came to Wyoming, sideways and argumentative, warm one day and snowing the next. The ground going soft and then freezing and then soft again, the animals restless with it, the whole landscape in a state of loud becoming. Eliza had never seen a Wyoming spring before. She found it exhausting and beautiful and entirely too loud after the long hush of February, and she loved it immediately. Maggie spent April mostly outside. She was nearly 3 now, and she had developed opinions, strong ones, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never once considered that her feelings might not be relevant. She had opinions about which chickens were her favorites and why. She had opinions about the correct direction to walk to the barn. She had an opinion about Croft's hat, which she had told him twice was the wrong color, and which he had not changed, and which she had accepted as a fundamental failing on his part that she was willing to overlook. Croft, for his part, had started saving her pieces of bread crust to give to the horses. He said it was because the horses needed the supplement. Nobody believed this. Dell had taught her to count to 10 in the time it took to walk between the house and the water trough. She counted everything now: eggs, fence posts, steps, the boards on the porch, which she had determined numbered 19, and which she recounted periodically to verify. One morning in early May, Eliza was hanging laundry on the line. The warm wind days were good for drying, the sheets coming out stiff and clean. When Maggie came around the corner of the house at full speed, which was the only speed she operated at, and stopped it in front of her. "Wyatt said there's a new horse," Maggie announced. Eliza kept hanging laundry. "There is. A young one. She came in with the supply wagon yesterday." "Can I name her?" Eliza looked down at her. Maggie had hay in her hair, which was normal, and mud on both knees, which was also normal, and an expression of absolute moral conviction about the naming of horses. "What would you call her?" Eliza asked. Maggie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Biscuit," she said. Eliza thought about this. "Why Biscuit?" "Because she's the same color," Maggie said, as if this were entirely obvious. Eliza looked at the laundry. "Go ask Wyatt." Maggie was gone around the corner before the sentence was finished. Eliza stood at the laundry line in the May morning, a sheet in her hands, the wind pulling at it, and she listened to the yard, to the sound of Maggie's feet on the hard ground, to Dell's voice somewhere near the barn, to the particular rhythm of the ranch going about its business in the warmth of the new season. And she felt something she didn't immediately name because it was too large and too simple at the same time. She felt arrived. Not at a destination she'd planned. She had not planned any of this. Not the bench at the station, not the wagon coming through the dark, not the barn or the contract or Schofield's office, or the night in the kitchen when she'd said out loud the things she'd been refusing to say. She had not planned to be standing at a laundry line in Wyoming on a May morning with her heart this quiet. You don't plan the things that matter most. You plan for safety and stability and the absence of disaster, and those are necessary things to plan for, and planning for them is its own form of dignity. But what you actually get, when you get something worth having, is rarely what you arranged. It comes through the side door you found by accident in your first week, on a night when the structure is coming down, and everything depends on you knowing where it is. She had found it by paying attention, by deciding, even when she was frightened and uncertain and not at all sure she was welcome, to know the place she was in, to treat it as real rather than temporary, to act as though she belonged until she did. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood before. Not fully, not in her body, the way she understood it now. Belonging was not given. It was not waiting for her in the right arrangement or the right man or the right contract. Belonging was what happened when you stopped standing at the edge of a place and walked to the middle of it and started doing the work. She had done the work, and here she was. They were married on the first Saturday in June, in the yard of the ranch, with the Aldridges and the Farrows and Cal Briggs, and his family, and Walt Pruitt from the post office, and a justice of the peace from Millhaven, who arrived 2 hours late because his horse had been obstinate about a mud patch on the North Road, and who apologized to everyone individually, which took some time. Ruth Aldridge cried, which she denied doing. Dell cried openly and without apology. Croft did not cry but stood very straight and was observed blinking several times in quick succession, which everyone agreed to accept as weather-related. Maggie wore a dress that Eliza had made from a piece of blue cotton she'd been saving since March, and she was supposed to stand still during the ceremony, and she stood still for approximately 45 seconds before she went to stand next to Wyatt and put her hand in his, which nobody had arranged, and which meant that the justice of the peace conducted the ceremony with a 2-year-old holding the groom's hand, and it was the most truthful version of the thing that could have happened. After, when the food was eaten and the yard was loud with the kind of noise that good company makes, Eliza stood near the fence with a cup of something and watched the people in the yard, in the yard of the place she had arrived at through a night and a bench and a coat that smelled like horses. And she thought about what she would say if someone asked her how she'd gotten here. She would say, "I paid attention. I made myself useful. I found the side door." She would say, "I was in so much trouble that I stopped being careful about trust, and that turned out to be the right thing." She would say, "A man I didn't know did something decent when he didn't have to, and I did something decent back. And we kept doing that until we'd built something neither of us could have built alone." What she knew, what she understood now in the way you only understand things when you're standing in the middle of them, was this. The frontier does not care about your plans. It does not care about your contracts or your correspondence or the promises made in letters with fold lines worn through from being read too many times. It only cares about what you do when the structure starts coming down, whether you know where the side door is, whether you go through it. She had gone through it. So had he. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. Not a perfect story, not a clean one, Not one without damage and cold, and the long, slow work of proving yourself to a place that had no particular reason to accept you. Just two people who had both learned, through loss and difficulty, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to be done. That family was not always the thing you were born into. Sometimes it was the thing you walked toward in the dark, not knowing if it would hold you, choosing to find out anyway. Maggie had fallen asleep against Wyatt's shoulder by the time the last wagon left. He carried her inside without waking her, the way he had carried her things on the first night. Without ceremony, without making it a moment, just doing it because it was what needed doing. Eliza watched him lay the child down in the room that would soon be replaced by something larger, something built for her, something that was hers. He came back out to the main room. She was at the table. He sat across from her. The lamp was between them, the same as always, steady and warm. "Done," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the June night was warm for Wyoming, and the stars were out over the ranch that had once been a quiet place of right-sized emptiness, and was now, without announcement, something else entirely. She reached across the table. He took her hand. They sat like that for a while. No particular hurry, nowhere else to be.